Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. I'm your host, Kev Cooling. I've been a sustainability practitioner for about 20 years, and I started this podcast to share insights into the world of carbon, climate change and sustainability by speaking to a whole range of people, experts in their field. If you enjoy listening to the podcast, please like it, leave a review and share with anyone else you think might be interested. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get into the chat. Welcome to Carbon Clarity, the podcast for the carbon curious. My name's Kev Cooling, your host, and today I'm very excited to be joined by Will Symons, Deloitte's Asia Pacific Sustainability Leader. How you doing, Will?
I'm great, Kev. Great to be with you, and hi to your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi to all of them. The many hordes of them who plague me regularly outside Carbon Clarity Towers here in the UK. It's a big thank you for joining me today, Will. You are calling in from...
Oh, I'm in Perth today, but I'm usually based in Melbourne in Australia.
I was going to say, I'm glad you said that last bit because we just would have need to be absolutely clear that we weren't talking about Scotland. So you're right. Yes, Perth, Australia. So thank you so much for dialing in.
Warmer than the Scottish version.
Yeah. Always. That's a pretty safe statement at any time of the year, I suspect. Fantastic. So what I love to do as the first thing when we open the show is get my guests just to give a 5-minute potted history of how you've got to where you are today.
Sure. So my passion for sustainability really started as a kid, and I had a pretty kind of stereotypical Australian upbringing, lots of time at the beach and surfing and camping in nature, etc. And from that, I developed a love for the environment. That then evolved until the point when I was at university. I studied environmental science. I got a bit involved in environmental activism when I was at university, and I figured out pretty quickly that wasn't for me. Sort of being on the outside, throwing metaphorical rocks, happily no actual rocks, and so I figured with some buddies of mine at university that we wanted to live a more critically constructive life and build a career for ourselves. So we established a program called Green Steps. And Green Steps was really for us originally. We brought in an external trading provider to help us learn about change management because we felt at university we were learning a lot about the problem, but not necessarily a lot about what to do about it. And so that was a great program. And being pretty, confident, maybe overconfident university students, we decided, hey, we could do this better than the external training provider. So we went and got a grant, and one thing led to another. And before we knew it, I was leading a national program based at Monash University, running at 8 different universities around the country, helping to provide a bridge for sustainability passionate students into the workforce. So I did that for a few years. I then decided to leave university and get a real job, as it were. And by the way, that program's still running. It's one of the longest running environmental training programs
how long's that
in the world. So that's we started that in 1999. So that shows my age.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
Yeah. So thousands of students have been through it. So it's an awesome program, and it's had lots of different iterations over the years. But I left that in 2005. I joined a company called AECOM. And I was there in Melbourne for a couple of years. And then, Kev, I moved to the UK, which is where we met. And so that was almost 20 years ago. In fact, it'll be 20 years ago in May that I met you.
Right, wow.
Worked in the UK for a few years, learned a lot about decarbonisation. The UK was and still is a long way ahead of Australia in that respect, particularly the regulatory arrangements, building codes, etc. I then went back to Australia, moved into an Asia Pacific sustainability role, and then 5 years ago I joined Deloitte, and I've been leading Deloitte's sustainability business ever since.
Wow, bit of a jet setter, fantastic. Not in a bad way, obviously. Just very very occasionally you take to the skies, but not often, I'm sure.
No, absolutely, absolutely in a bad way, Kev. I spend far too much time on planes.
Yeah, it's kind of. I mean, we're lucky in one way in the UK in that we don't need to fly to get to parts of the same country, whereas you guys in Australia, it's even a practical impossibility, really, isn't it, to go from Perth to Sydney or Melbourne or whatever it is without getting on a plane, I suppose.
Well, I did actually catch the train here once when I was a student, and it's 2 full days and 2 full nights, so not particularly practical for a few business meetings. Yeah.
No, it's crazy, isn't it? Okay, amazing, fantastic about Green Steps. I hadn't realised it was still going. And I know that when you're in the UK, we had some conversations, didn't we, with Monash University at the time to see if we could bring that into the UK. I don't think it came off at that point, but has it been kind of exported anywhere since then? Do you know?
So what has happened? So I don't think the Green Steps model has been exported, not that I'm aware of anyway. And I haven't actually been heavily involved in it since I left. It was a program that was, I suppose, my baby and my buddy's baby at the time. And you know, as babies need to grow up, they sort of need to be shepherded by others. So we sort of stepped away from it, and other people made their mark. But what Green Steps absolutely has done is created this incredible network globally of green steppers that are still in touch. Yeah. So, for example, you know, shout out to Joan Coe from Arup. She's, you know, Arup's an incredible firm that I know you know well, Kev. Joan is Arup's global sustainability leader now. She was a green stepper. So I've known her through that program for 25 years, et cetera. And, you know, there's multiple other senior sustainability leaders around the world who sort of grew up through that program.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's really, really good. This is a complete aside, but I remember doing some work for Oxford University when they established the Blavatnik School of Government. And it's kind of having the foresight and vision to know that we need to train people to do that stuff. You know, you don't just, I mean, a lot of sustainability people who have kind of been in the game as long as we have, almost kind of, well, you were deliberate, actually. I hadn't realized you were so deliberate about doing that, but I certainly wasn't intentional about doing it when I started my career. And you kind of fall into it and you grow up with it and you gain that experience, but actually kind of being intentional and recognizing that there are skills and things that you need and knowledge that you need to do those jobs effectively is brilliant, I think.
We're all in the business of change, and change is hard, and it's not intuitive. And the great thing about Green Steps, and there's other programs like it, is it's saying to university students, you're passionate about this topic, you've learnt a lot about it. Now, here's some tools to actually make you effective. Yeah, right, exactly. And talking about that then, I mean, not the students, but talking about you, what areas of sustainability, it's always been a broad church, isn't it, sustainability, but what areas particularly do you focus on? So my technical background, like you, Kev, I've been around the block a few times. So 26 years in sustainability. And what that means is I've done a bit of it, you know, bits and pieces of everything. Yeah. So when I was in the UK, I was doing a lot of decarbonisation strategy work, or carbon management, as it was called at the time, because that was where the work was from a consulting perspective. I used to do a lot of behavioural change work, which we can talk about a bit if you'd like, which was effectively kind of working in an organisation who wanted to achieve an outcome and supporting them to do that using behavioural change techniques. But my real area of technical depth is in physical risk. And so supporting our clients to understand the likely implications of climate change to their assets and operations. So that's like, if I'm a global expert in anything, it's that. So that's my technical background. At Deloitte, though, my role is to support and grow and invest and support our clients across the region through our partners. So we've got about 1,500 full-time practitioners across the region. And my job is to lead them. So unfortunately, I don't do a huge amount of client delivery anymore. Right. But so our business in Deloitte, as you would expect from an organisation with our heritage, we do a lot of sustainability disclosure related work. So sustainability reporting, supporting clients to understand these complex new rules, how to comply, how to drive value from that. But we also do a lot of energy transition work. We do a lot of nature related work. We do governance related, so it's a large organisation, and we operate kind of across most areas of sustainability from an advisory perspective. And presumably, I was going to ask where, but presumably just as the whole Asia Pacific region, right? So it's right across all of the various countries that kind of sit in that region. The next question I was going to ask you was about drivers, but it probably, you tell me, what do you think? What are the main drivers for your clients? So I'd say there's sort of three drivers for our clients. If you step back and kind of blur your eyes, the first is regulatory response, both supporting governments to create really effective regulation to achieve the outcomes that they're seeking, and supporting our private sector clients to comply with that regulation. And so in particular at the moment, sustainability reporting is huge, but there's also lots of other regulatory instruments. If you think about pollutant reporting or waste management regulations or environmental permitting, et cetera. So regulatory response is one. The second I would put in the bucket of opportunity creation or value creation. So the net zero journey in particular, and this enormous transformation that our energy systems are undergoing, is creating huge opportunities for our clients. And so, for example, we're working for one of the world's biggest industrial products company who have a very strong business in building and selling transformers and substations and electrical facilities. And so they've been really doubling down on that because they see that there's a huge amount of work to be won from electrification, for example. So that's just, but I could give you many more examples. And then the third, which is a really rapidly growing area, is that our clients, both government and private sector, are seeing increasing damages from climate change. So they're needing to understand what those damages are likely to be into the future, identify what the gap is between where they want to be and where they are in terms of their risk exposure, and then do something about it. And that's what adaptation is. So we do a lot of that sort of work as well.
Yeah. I mean, it did strike me, from the outside, that was going to be a significant, as well as the kind of mitigation piece, that kind of transition is hopefully happening everywhere to a greater or lesser degree and a greater or lesser speed. But the issue of kind of climate risk feels like it's very real for that particular region, I guess. I'm interested. I mean, obviously climate change is a global issue and it's affected by global events and politics. Have you seen any kind of chilling effect given the kind of the position generally of global politics right now? Have you seen any kind of chilling effect there and kind of people slowing down on stuff or pulling back?
It's a really interesting question, Kev, and it's not a simple one to answer. But so let me start by saying in all my career, and like you, I've spent my career advising clients in private sector, public sector, clients across all, really across all sectors. And I've never seen a bigger gap between what you hear and read about in the media and what our clients are saying.
Yeah.
So the sentiment in the media is negative about sustainability. When I speak to our clients, what they say is that nothing material has changed. And I'll give you an example. I was hosting a roundtable of chief financial officers in one of our Asia Pacific countries just a couple of months ago. And one of the CFOs, and these are Chatham House rules meetings, so I can't disclose who it was, but it was a global brand. He was the CFO of a global brand name corporation, and he asked that exact question to me. He said, "Are your clients slowing down? Are they stepping back from sustainability commitments?" And I said, "Well, are you?" And he said, "No, nothing's changed." So what has happened is that the narrative has shifted. There's a global cooling of the narrative around sustainability. What hasn't happened, particularly for our clients in Asia Pacific and in other regions, it's probably slightly different. What hasn't happened is a change to the fundamental drivers of why corporates act. So they still have to respond to sustainability disclosure rules. There's still enormous investment opportunities from this revolution in our energy systems. And there's escalating damages from physical risks. Now, what individual A or individual B says in the media doesn't change those fundamental facts. That's what our clients respond to. They respond to facts and science and what they're facing in a very objective way. Anyone who's spent time with CFOs knows they're a very objective, rational group. So I think that's a really important thing that we index to. There's a lot of noise, but what's the signal? Well, actually, the signals have changed largely, except in one respect, and that is a good thing, mostly. That whereas 10 years ago, it was kind of okay for in particular corporates to release a net zero by 2030 goal and for there really to be nothing behind it. Like they haven't allocated capital, they maybe haven't even really understood exactly what they need to do to get there. Those days are over.
Yeah.
And they're over because of litigation that's happened around the world, etc. So what's happened is the sustainability agenda has moved from the marketing department or the HR department to the CFO, the COO, and into each organizational pillar. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's this cooling of enthusiasm in the media, because there's less announceables. There's just more business, like it's just more integrated into the everyday operations of businesses. And our corporate clients are nervous about saying too much because it's hard. And what if they don't achieve their targets?
Yeah.
Will they be raked over the coals for doing that, etc.? So, sorry, it's a bit of a long-winded answer, but I think it's a really important moment to index to.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I'm seeing exactly the same here. People aren't being quite as vocal as they were. When everyone was kind of bringing out their targets, everyone was very vocal about it. They were kind of, demonstrating their commitment to the notion of net zero and all those other things. And now I think a lot of them are doing exactly what you say. They're quietly realizing that actually having made this commitment, they're now thinking, oh, actually that's actually quite difficult, isn't it, to achieve that? And it's like, yes, it is. Yes, it is. One of those very worthwhile things. It's not easy, but and the conversations I have in boardrooms really are, you can almost see it dawning on the faces of the people around the table when you say, this isn't just mean you're going to need to change your electricity provider or change your lights or whatever. This means a really fundamental reconsideration of how you go about doing your business, whatever that business is, because it really is as significant as that. And I think there'll always be opportunities for those organizations that really embrace it, because if you can get them to a place where they're thinking about the opportunity rather than just the cost, then I think there's a lot to be said for it. In the boardrooms, are you seeing much in the way of chief sustainability officers? I wondered when you were saying that. You say it sits with CFOs and things, and it does, of course, because a bit like finance, that's everybody's responsibility. But so is sustainability, because it touches everything that goes on. But are you seeing many CSOs in boardrooms?
So what I'm seeing is 4 or 5 years ago, there was a big wave of CSOs being hired. And what's happening now is I think there's more integration, because when our clients make that realization, actually, this is a really fundamental risk and opportunity, you don't want to have it sitting in a functional area. You want to have it like things like health and safety or many other, depending on the sector, many other issues or opportunities that organizations face. You want it to be integrated across the executive team. So yes, there are still very senior, highly capable CSOs in many of our global clients. There is a trend, I think, in some organizations for those roles to become more of a internal consulting group rather than owning the problem. So, for example, there's a clear trend globally that CFOs are taking over responsibility for sustainability reporting. And that's because sustainability reporting fundamentally is material to organizations' share price. They're now material disclosures. There's material risks associated with gaps in those disclosures. And the CFO organizations are very well versed in managing data and having the right governance systems, having the right data systems, etc., to ensure that there's no material gaps in disclosures. So in that context, then the sustainability reporting probably 10 years ago would have been the CSO's responsibility.
Yeah.
They're now becoming an advisor to the CFO.
Yeah.
A technical advisor to the CFO.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing that across the board. So, for another example, that organization that I mentioned, who are really benefiting from electrification, that wouldn't make sense for the CSO to look after that. That needs to be within that business unit, needs to be driven within that business unit of that organization. And again, then the CSO can provide technical support, advice, etc. So I think if I was to make a prediction, that's where we're going with CSO roles, is sort of more of an internal consulting group to advise across pillars.
Because of course you do need that technical understanding, don't you? And it's like with everything, as we learn more and things become more kind of specialized and sort of granular, you need individuals who've got that expertise, to be able to advise or whatever. I mean, you see so many different flavors of ways that organizations approach sustainability, don't you? You see those complete sustainability teams who've got their own budget and it's a decent budget. You see somebody who's got it tacked on to a job and, it's actually not really something that they are held to account for and everything in between. And presumably you think that kind of transferring that stuff to the CFO role kind of is a good thing because it really kind of means it's at the top table, doesn't it? It's really kind of baked into the organization's way of thinking and the way of working, I guess.
I think that any organization that is operating in a jurisdiction where there are these strict new sustainability reporting mandates in place, in particular those that are requiring reasonable or limited assurance, if it doesn't sit in the office of the CFO as a responsibility, I would see that as material risk.
Yeah.
Because it's hard, it's complicated. And so, as you say, organizations manage things differently. There can be different levels of responsibility between the CFO organization and the CSO organization, but you really want to have that governance, the risk controls, the systems, the internal audit, all everything that organizations have done for many years really well for financial data to be applied to sustainability data.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The same level of rigor. It should be exactly the same, shouldn't it? And in some ways, I mean, maybe that's not good for me and people like me, consultants who kind of do that carbon accounting for people, because ultimately you want that to be just a function like their normal accounting process, right? So maybe then the role becomes a bit more auditing or whatever it is, maybe. But yeah, I would be happy with that if everyone understood it and was able to do it effectively. You mentioned as one of your three issues the kind of regulatory landscape and governments and things like that at a national level. Obviously, Asia Pacific contains some of the world's most vulnerable nations when it comes to climate change. Micronesia and Solomon Islands and Tonga and all those people. Do you see much action? And I'm thinking because of COP and everything else and people's perhaps waning support for UN and the COPs. Do you see much action to support those nations with becoming resilient and adapting to climate change?
So yes, but not enough.
Yeah.
And I also just want to pick up the point that you made about COPs, and I think that this is one area where there's, again, in my view, a bit of a gap. So I had the privilege of going to Berlin. Colleagues of mine were heavily involved in supporting that COP from a private sector perspective. I was involved in COP 29, where Deloitte was the primary advisor to the presidency. Multilateralism and the COP process is not dead. In fact, we need to remind ourselves that 10 years ago, last month, this incredible agreement was signed, the Paris Climate Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, we were heading towards a 4+ degree world in 2100. And just, we talk these numbers, but just to remind your listeners, a 4+ degree world equals catastrophic climate change, meters of sea level. So, next time you go down to the ocean, stand there and look at the sea and imagine 5-6 meters on top of that, and then think about what that would do for civilization. That's where we're headed. That's where we were headed 10 years ago. We're now headed towards about 2.5 degrees. That's a fundamentally different world. That's only because of Paris. That Paris Agreement. So yes, COP disappoints every time because we're not doing enough. We're not going fast enough. It's a messy process. It's consensus driven, which means that it moves slowly. But every single time we're moving the ball forwards, and that was no different in Belém. So yes, let's hold ourselves to account and say we're not moving fast enough. But let's also recognize that actually the UNFCCC and the 32 years now of COPs, the first was in 1992, 33 years, have been one of the best examples of multilateralism that we've ever had in the world. It's one of the only parts of the UN system that is still functioning. 60,000 people in Berlin.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a lot more effective than the Security Council, perhaps. But okay, I mean, that's great. I mean, that's really encouraging, isn't it? That actually, despite the noises that you hear and the kind of people's reflections on, and it does come from, I think, the fact that people would like to see quicker progress, and we need to see quicker progress. But what it does, I suppose, is slightly overshadows the fact that there has been progress,
So I'll give you an
and it's very
example.
meaningful.
Yeah, like a really concrete example. So China, President Xi from China, and I'm paraphrasing here, this isn't an exact quote, basically said a few weeks ago, we're decarbonizing, we don't care what the rest of the world's doing.
Yeah.
Now that might be, I might be taking some liberty with the exact quote, but that was the sentiment. China have set their first NDC, nationally determined contribution. This is the targets that countries sign up to through the Paris Agreement process for an absolute reduction in emissions. If they achieve that, and China's a country who has a history of overachieving every time with their climate commitments, they achieved most of their 2030 NDCs last year, 6 years ahead of plan. If China achieves their NDC by 2035, that's the equivalent of taking multiple Australias off the emissions ledger. That was achieved through the Paris Agreement process, through this COP process that was announced before COP. So I think one of the challenges with COPs is it feels really disconnected from everyone's day-to-day lives. It's very technical. The agreements feel, really slow. How does it actually trickle down and affect individuals in their day-to-day lives? And I think it's incumbent on people like you and me, Kev, who've been in this space forever, to help communicate. Well, actually, it really does. It really does affect the day-to-day lives of people.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, it's interesting what you say about China as well, because one of the things that I hear a lot when I speak to people, and I desperately try to leave the soapbox in the cupboard, but occasionally it comes out. And when I talk about this stuff to my friends and others, in the UK particularly, there's a lot of sentiment about the fact that we're only a small nation, and globally our domestic emissions are quite small. And I'm fairly quick to point out, well, they are quite small, but it's only because we just import everything. So if we think about the size of our economy and we think about the impact we're having globally on kind of the global carbon emissions for inventory, then it's much more significant. And if somebody like China does that kind of by default reduces the actual amount of emissions that the UK is responsible for, and loads of other nations, incidentally. China's almost like the manufacturing capital of the world, isn't it? So I mean, that's great, and that's really encouraging that hopefully people are encouraged by that and can recognise that, whilst on the surface the COPs don't look particularly successful, actually they've done some great stuff over the years and continue to do so, I guess. It's even if there's not enough investment to support vulnerable nations, and even if those things, which of course we need to address and needs to be fixed, but nonetheless.
So let's be clear, nothing's happening fast enough. We need to be decarbonising at 3 times the pace we are now to reduce dangerous climate change. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. This is really the only invest mechanism we have. In terms of China, just to give you a stat that I found astounding, a couple of years ago, China accounted for 30% of global economic growth. They account for 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now compare that with the US. The US is a third of that from an emissions perspective. They're around 10%.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, 40% of Chinese economic growth was through climate technologies, batteries, EVs, solar, wind, electrolyzers. 40% of Chinese economic growth. That's why China's acting. They're acting because they're exporting a huge amount of manufactured goods, supporting other countries to decarbonize. And we need to remember that if you import an EV, for most countries, EVs and oil are their 2 biggest imports. Sorry, cars and oil are their 2 biggest imports. If you import EVs, you don't need to import oil. That's the other reason China's decarbonizing.
Yeah.
So it's not just about climate action. It's about national security, sovereignty, supply chain resilience, energy independence. So reflecting on the UK, a country I know really well, having lived there for several years, the UK is not energy independent. It imports a huge amount of fossil fuels.
Yep.
We saw the impact of that with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. So building a sovereign energy system, electrifying your energy system, is not just about climate action. It's about all those other things as well.
Yep.
And meaning you're not having to import fossil fuels from countries that don't necessarily share your values.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Thinking domestically for you, I was really interested when you just said before that Australia is perhaps further behind in the UK when it comes to kind of its, regulatory framework and so on. But there are examples where the UK has absolutely learned things from Australia. One really good example is the Neighbours scheme, which people may or may not know about. I think I mentioned it on the show before. NABERS, not neighbours as in the show. Although that obviously too is a wonderful import into the UK. And Neighbours is really getting some traction in the UK now, particularly in London, as often these things are adopted in London first. But I was wondering, do you think, is there anything else that we in the UK might learn from our Aussie friends?
Yeah, there are, I think. And this is a wonderful thing for me in my career. I'm sure some of your listeners perhaps are sort of early career sustainability professionals. The time that I spent in the UK learning from incredible professionals like you, Kev, and other colleagues, it was such an incredible experience because I could then take that knowledge and go back to Australia and try and apply it there, which was great for my career, but also hopefully good on in a very small way, my contribution to Australia. So Australia is one of the most vulnerable countries on the planet to climate change, the physical impacts of climate change. So Australia has warmed already by more than 1.5 degrees. We have a climate that's already extreme. So Australia is well known. We have droughts. We then have bushfires, followed by a flood, followed by a cyclone, followed by another. That's our natural environment. But what climate change is doing is intensifying that. So the droughts are worse, the bushfires are worse. We've just had some terrible bushfires in New South Wales, actually, in sort of early December. Tragically, a firefighter lost his life as a result of that. So what's happening in Australia is that intensification of the climatic system. What that means is that Australia's got some pretty sophisticated approaches to building resilience. And so that, understanding what the physical risks are and then thinking through how do we fund the marginal cost of adaptation so that we're spending that $1 before that saves $10 after. That is an area that Australia can contribute. And another is that Australia's electricity grid is decarbonising faster than most on the planet. So that's right, yeah. So we had a system that was primarily powered by coal. We've got a lot of coal in Australia that's very close to the surface, very cheap and easy to dig up. It's now through scaled rollout of solar and wind. Australia's got one of the highest penetrations of rooftop solar in the world. I think now over 1/3 of all households have solar panels on their roof, which is, so it's a almost sort of an experiment in how do you drive massively increased penetration of distributed renewables into the system. There's now negative prices most days in the middle of the day because of that incredible penetration of solar, both on rooftops and large-scale solar. South Australia is an exemplar of this, where they're running at 100% renewables for many days a year. So climate resilience, how to respond to the physical impacts of climate change is one area that I think Australia is doing an okay job at. Another is how do you manage distributed sources of generation in a grid that was designed for really large coal-fired power and how do you adapt that system to that new?
Do you? Sorry, I was just to jump in there to ask you a question. Your electricity network, is that nationally owned or state owned, or is it in sort of private hands?
Great question. It's a mix and it's a mess. So So like in the UK, we had this wave of privatisation in the late 90s, so we have a federal system of states that's more akin to the US than to the UK in terms of devolved powers.
Yeah.
So electricity networks were owned by the states. All of them progressed along the pathway towards full privatisation. Some of them stopped before they got there. So in some states, we have corporatised but state-owned. In other states, we have privatised monopoly providers. Yeah. But what we do have is an East Coast network that's inclusive of Tasmania, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, that's managed by a federal entity. So it's a bit of a mix and a bit of a mess. It's different in every state.
In some ways, a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas, isn't it? Because if you're investing in the changes to the infrastructure that allow you to have that distributed generation network going on, one of the things about renewable energy is that it's not consistent, not constant, it's not consistent, solar and wind and whatever. But presumably you've suddenly got a lot less need for huge centralized power stations. So the role of those, where those companies are privatized, presumably reduces. There's still work to do in terms of managing the network, but in the UK it's kind of slightly separate. It's a separation between generation and managing the network. So yeah, it's interesting that it's happening so fast, and even though you've got sort of privatized companies in the mix.
So we have the 4 tiers of electricity generation are managed and regulated separately. So generators, transmission, distribution, and retail. So it's slightly different to the UK in that we have full retail contestability. So you and I, Kev, could go out and start a retailer. And what that's driven is significant innovation in that sort of customer-facing aspect.
Yeah.
What all of the big generators, the incumbent coal-fired or gas-fired power generators, they're all investing heavily in renewables. So they're the ones who are actually doing most of the build-out. And that's because they're coal-fired power stations. No one's built a new coal-fired power station in Australia for many years. They're kind of clapped out. They break down. Yeah. They actually are. I think those and there's just a few of them who own the big coal-fired power generators. They're the biggest investors because they need to replace that as a revenue source, and I don't think that there's much holding back of that. There's enormous technical challenges because you're moving from a grid where, in my home state in Victoria, all the coal-fired power was in the Latrobe Valley, which was a couple of 100 kilometres to the east of Melbourne. So huge transmission lines coming into Melbourne, to now where it's everywhere. There's solar in the northwest, there's wind along the coast, there's distributed generation on rooftops. That's really expensive. And so that's actually the thing that's really holding back the transition in Australia, is that investment in that transmission distribution, in particular transmission infrastructure. And in fact, I think a lack of regard to social license. Because people don't want big power pylons marching across the landscape. Yep. And so there are issues that we're having to address where we've, I think, perhaps not had enough regard to maintaining and sort of building the social license needed for that system build out. Yeah.
I haven't thought about it particularly, but I wonder if there's an element of the greater good in there somewhere. And you think, well, okay, if it means it's like wind, it's like the argument about wind turbines, perhaps, I don't know, where people say, oh, well, it's ugly, I don't want a wind turbine. But I think, actually, do you know what? If you don't just look at the physical object and think about what that is doing, I think it gives it some credit in that area, and you say, okay, well, fair enough, maybe it's not the most beautiful thing, but I'd rather see that than a pylon, or, I like the thing that is doing, as well as being a physical object in the landscape. So anyway, who knows? Personal opinion, I guess.
And I understand that perspective. I suppose I can also understand the perspective of a farmer who might have been there for 4 or 5 generations. They like living in a rural area. They like their views, and they don't want what looks like an industrial facility, these huge pylons marching across their land. That's a really fundamental change to land that they're often have stewarded through generations. They're very passionate about. It's their home. So on the one hand, we need them to decarbonize, and that's in the interest of farmers, of course, because they're on the front line of climate change. But on the other, people don't want ugly pylons on their land. So these aren't simple things to resolve.
No, they're not. And in the UK particularly, you could definitely have a whole show on how natural the bucolic idyll is, when you go into the countryside, entirely a function of what society has done to the landscape, isn't it? It's not really natural at all. But anyway, okay, that's good. I mean, I guess you would say something around kind of adaptation and resilience, and that feels like something that we need to step up on in the UK. We've seen more wildfires in the UK in the last few years than we've had ever, I guess. So definitely that's the sort of thing where we should be looking to those who have got more experience, unfortunately, more experience than us. I wanted to almost come right back 20 years ago, Will, when we first met, and the work you were doing at AECOM then was particularly around kind of behavior change. Well, that's kind of what, I mean, we've, both work on carbon management stuff, but that behavior change piece was really significant. And it started me down a kind of a route as well, I guess, where I've done a reasonable amount of behavior change stuff. And back then we were talking a lot about Doug Mackenzie Moore, and I went on his course and it was very interesting and great, and his book was good. I think I've moved on from there, having had quite a bit more experience of it, and been involved in some doctorate research and all that kind of stuff. So what's your latest thinking on behavior change in a nutshell?
So, and for the listeners who haven't heard of Doug Mackenzie Moore, he was an incredible leader. He's a Canadian who really kicked off this global practice of behavioral change for sustainability, bringing lots of ideas from psychology and etc. So the first thing I'd say is we need to accelerate. We need to do far more. So I'm all for kind of an all of the above strategy, whatever works.
Yeah.
My view around behavioral change is that on a societal level, I'm pretty skeptical about whether it was sort of behavioral economics. And I think generally the research suggests that except in very limited and specific circumstances, there's not that much great evidence for whole of societal behavioral change. In fact, one counterpoint to that is in Melbourne during the millennial drought, there was an incredible change in behaviour around water use. And it was built around social pressure. So it became socially unacceptable to be out watering your garden with a hose during those drought conditions. So there are some counterpoints, but I think they're the exception that prove the rule. Where I do think it works, where there's a system that is constrained, where you can control some of the levers that can help change behaviour. So I'll give you an example. When I was in the UK, I worked with one of the big bus companies operating in the UK, and their challenge was that drivers were kind of accelerating off the bus stop and then braking heavily into the next one in London, where I think the average speed of the traffic was like 8 miles per hour or something.
Right, yeah.
So it actually makes zero difference how fast you accelerate, and in fact it causes injuries because elderly people get on and they fall over, etc. So what we worked on with them was effectively a program that created a competition that rewarded bus drivers who didn't do that, and built a system of rewards and sort of social pressure and etc. That works. But on a whole of societal level, I suppose my view is that we need to avoid seeking to preach or judge people. A lot of people have different values, and people are just busy in their lives. The fact is most people aren't going or don't have the time to do loads of research into what's the most sustainable option, etc. So, I mentioned I do a lot of flying earlier. If we think that the way to solve the aviation challenge in relation to climate is to tell people to stop flying, I mean, forget about it. And is that actually a good thing? No. We want people to connect. We want people to fly to China and see what's happening. It's like going to the future. You go to Shanghai, like 90% EVs, and it's clean and it's quiet, etc. We want people to connect more and build relationships with people. That's what the aviation industry does. We need to decarbonize the aviation industry. So my view is we need to drive systemic change to ensure that the energy systems that we all rely on are sustainable. Most people have no control over that.
Yeah. I mean, at a societal level, I guess there are examples, I think, where you can use behavioral change techniques to create societal level change. A really good example is the donor card example, where in the UK, it used to be an opt-in system. I think it's an opt-out system now. I can't think if it's like in the UK or anyway. In countries where they've switched from an opt-in system to an opt-out system, the participation in organ donation has inevitably skyrocketed. So there are things you can do, and it's almost not something you're asking somebody to consciously do. It's just you're changing the framework in which they're making decisions, I suppose, and that's really important. You're right, of course, that individuals some individuals or few individuals have agency in those areas that you talk about. But of course, there are individuals that have agency in those spaces. There are CEOs and CFOs and everything else, who are kind of able to make those changes. And I think in the same way as any other individual, they're driven by, my thinking on it is it's come down to the fact that there are really only two ways to persuade people to do things: the carrot or the stick. And that's kind of it, beyond that kind of default behavior stuff and, people forget to do things or whatever. It's really carrot and stick. So on the one hand, you can provide incentives like the bus drivers, where you said, we'll reward you for doing a particular thing, behaving in a particular way. And in the same way, you might penalize somebody in the same way if they didn't display a certain behavior or if they did do things. So, but that at a really practical level and being intentional about the behaviors that you want to see in an organization, I think are ways that behavior change techniques can be really effectively applied. So if, for example, you're saying to everybody in your organization, if you're leading the department, your department needs to contribute this much to the reduction of our carbon emissions. But when you come to the annual appraisal and their balanced scorecard, it doesn't say anything about reducing emissions. There's neither a carrot nor a stick, and they won't do it. So you've got to kind of build those things in the same way that you require them to achieve a certain financial performance or, a certain something to do with their people or whatever. It's exactly the same. So I don't see it any differently to that, really. And we've been using these techniques for years in other aspects of what we want people, individuals and corporations to do. So anyway, but I think, I enjoyed the Doug Mackenzie Moore thing. I think he was a pioneer and we've learned so much more since then. I think it's the truth.
Agree.
I think. Okay, so we're kind of coming to the end of our time a little bit, but is there any kind of other things you see happening in the world of sustainability right now that the listeners might be interested to hear about?
So no conversation at the moment is complete without talking about AI.
Okay, yep.
And something that I'm really interested in fact, I'm writing a piece on this at the moment that we're going to release in February or March, is AI and climate.
Yep.
And in particular, how can we supply energy for AI data centers? Yeah. It's not just AI data centers, actually, because of this breakdown in global trust, it's also sovereign data centers and enterprise data centers where, we had this big shift towards the cloud. There's now a bit of a shift in some respects backwards into enterprise data centers. So there's a big, huge data center build out that's happening and that's going to move forward. So that's a really interesting area around how can we make sure that we supply that using renewables. And the good news is that renewables have some benefits that other sources of energy don't have. They're the fastest form of energy to build usually in most places. They're cheap, etc. They have some issues as well because you need lots of land. That land is usually remote from where the data center is, etc. But then there's this other question about the use of AI for climate solutions, because a lot of what we're talking about, Kev, particularly around resilience, they're really complicated questions. And, to give you an example, we're working with one of the big airlines in the US at the moment using AI-based techniques to increase the fuel efficiency of their flight routes. Because, as you'd imagine, there's winds blowing in different directions at different levels, there's takeoff. It's very complicated, and AI-based techniques can really materially reduce fuel use. So it's, net, I think AI is going to be a positive thing for climate. And that's not what we hear about a lot. So I would just encourage your listeners, when they hear AI is going to destroy the world because of its climate impact, let's just firstly recognize we have no idea, because 2 years ago, no one had heard of ChatGPT. But also this incredible computational power is going to be needed to help us derive some of these much more complex solutions to this climate challenge. And I think that's really interesting.
I think it is. I think you're right. The thoughtful application of AI, I think, has got so much potential to help us solve all sorts of problems, doesn't it? From medical diagnosis to, as you say, efficiency in aircraft flights or whatever. Okay, I think I agree with that. AI is massive, and we're just scratching the surface of it, aren't we? In fact, I had an interesting conversation with Anna Menezes a few episodes ago, who was talking about the kind of impact of energy and data sets and that kind of stuff. So that's an interesting listen as well. Okay, so look, tell me, what's next, Will, for you? What's next for Deloitte in your work? Can you give us a bit of a heads up what's coming up for you, other than your writing being published in February or March?
So what's coming up for me is a good break and some time down at the beach. And sorry for your UK-based listeners, but
we record on the 8th of December, and you're on about going down the beach. Good.
It's a pretty nice time of year, and so
not jealous
that's what's
at
next
all.
for me. What's next for Deloitte doesn't really matter. We exist to help our clients, and so we've talked a bit about that in terms of what they're focused on. I think we haven't talked at all about nature. Many of your listeners will have seen that IFRS has announced that they're going to be releasing a new standard as part of their ISSB series focused on nature in 2027, I believe. And that's going to be really significant, particularly in Japan, which is our largest sustainability business in Asia Pacific.
Oh, okay.
Japan has by far the largest number of TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures registrants. So I think that's really interesting because that's again this double materiality approach. How do you rely upon nature? How are you impacting nature? So I think that's really interesting. And as someone from the top of the podcast, what really motivates me is sort of natural systems and the natural world. That's going to be interesting to kind of bring into the much more mainstream conversations. We do a bit of work in nature across the region, but it's probably not a really core mainstream thing that many of our clients are thinking about. And I think that will elevate the role that nature plays in underpinning value creation for our clients.
Yeah, definitely. I have interest on the TNFDs. Obviously Japan sounds like it's a big market. Are you seeing that a lot of take up on the TNFDs, a lot of kind of positive response?
So there was.
Okay.
I suppose my personal observation and view is that a lot of the oxygen came out of that market when these big mandatory disclosure regimes were announced.
Okay.
And I think a lot of that just comes down to human capacity. Most jurisdictions in Asia Pacific are aligned with ISSB S1, S2, or slight variations of those, and it's complicated. And so just the people that were thinking about nature had to now think about these mandatory disclosure. So I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I think also we talked about the integration of sustainability into the role of the CFO. I think some CFOs still really struggle to draw a line between sustainability performance and how their organization creates value. Nature's even further away from them being able to articulate that. And I think having a global standard for how to think that through, which is what those disclosure standards are all about, will really help with that.
Yeah, I agree. I said to somebody just the other day, it might have been on the last episode or something, but it's taken a long time for the world of sustainability, sort of excluding nature, to get to grips with how to articulate the value of its proposition. So you can see that hopefully we'll get there a lot quicker when it comes to the nature piece. But yeah, it's taken a long time really to be able to have the meaningful conversations that everybody else in the boardroom understands, in terms of impact and value. Well, look, Will, that has been such a far-ranging conversation. Actually, we've covered such a broad range of topics, and I'm now thinking to myself, maybe we should get together again and speak about nature. I'd love to do that. That would be brilliant. But for now, Will, thank you very much indeed for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening to Carbon Clarity. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button, share it with your network, and subscribe to make sure you never miss another episode. Catch you next time.